level. And so if you calculate this number, that average level divided by the average amount that people are above that level, you get exactly alpha. So it's not a coincidence that I used alpha for this variable. Alpha is roughly 1.5. And so if you just, that's even simpler to compute out that other formula. If you just plug in alpha and an average elasticity variable, you get that if elasticity were 0.1, that it would be 0.87 would be the optimal tax rate. If it were 1, the optimal tax rate would be 0.4. Now, if alpha were equal to 3, which is what it's more like in Europe, right, then you would get 1/3 over 1/3 plus 1, which is what? 1/3 over 4/3. That's 1/4, right? So the optimal taxes on the rich would be much lower, maybe even lower than they are on the rest of the population. You would have a regressive rather than a progressive system if alpha were equal to 3. And that's roughly the value that it has in Europe. So what that says is that despite the fact that we have less progressive taxes than the Europeans do, actually they should have more regressive taxes than we do because they have less equal society. They have more equal societies at the top end of the distribution. More of the inequalities in the mid part of the distribution in their societies compared to ours. Okay, so remember that our optimal taxes for the rest of the population were 0.67, 0.48, 0.38, 0.26 if the elasticities were these variables. So what that says is that if the elasticities for the rich and the rest of us are similar, then we should have a progressive tax system. And taxes should be rising as you get wealthier. And, obviously, it's not going to typically be optimal to just have tax rates be, jump for people above $1 million. They should probably gradually ramp up. This sort of gives you a sense of what it would look like. Now, evidence on the elasticities of income are more complex than this, but there's a lot of it as well. Unfortunately, almost all the evidence comes from short-term changes. So it's like the tax will be lower this particular year, and then we'll say, did we earn more tax revenue this year because the taxes were lower? And the problem with this is that on the one hand, it biases upward taxable income elasticities. What are taxable income elasticities? That's how much income do people report earning. People are going to report earning a lot more money in years when taxes are low, because they're going to find a way to shift that income forward from other years or backward in order to try to pay a lower tax rate on it. And that's not a real elasticity that we care about. We really care about the long-run elasticity, not the short-run elasticity, right? On the other hand, the long-run elasticity might be bigger than the short-run elasticity. This was the case where something was storable. What are things that are durable? Well, what career you choose to work in, whether you choose to drop out of the labor force entirely, all those sorts of things are long-lasting decisions that if you know that taxes will be high for a long period of time, you might do, but you wouldn't change them based on just 1 year of taxes being high, right? Okay, so what the evidence has shown, to the extent we have it, is that labor supply elasticity is pretty low for the rich in the short term, but that their taxable income elasticity is very large. And Andy, why do you think that that might be true?
Because there are certain ways that you would get out of having to pay the full amount.
Yeah, so the rich are very good at hiding taxes, right? And so you'd think in a short-term change in taxes, they would have a very large taxable income elasticity, but not so much labor supply elasticity, right? So my guess, but there's a huge amount of controversy over this, is that the right number here might be as high as 0.3 because things in the long term might be bigger than in the short term, but it's not going to be much bigger than that. And it could be pretty close to 0.1 or something like that. So pretty low. And I think that just squares with our intuitions. If you've ever met someone who's wealthy or ambitious, et cetera, and you say, imagine that they weren't getting paid quite as much, they would still be ambitious. I mean, it's like the idea of someone switching from like working really hard to being lazy, who's like a really high performing person who like went to the University of Chicago because they're not being paid as much. seems to me a bit silly. It's like, the most ambitious, high-performing people want to be at the top of whatever social hierarchy you put them onto. And it really doesn't matter exactly how much they're paid or whatever. They just want to be at the top, right? On the other hand, the middle class, especially middle-class women, tend to have quite a reasonably high labor supply elasticity. And their taxable income elasticity tends to be pretty similar, because it's much harder for them to shift taxes back and forth from the future, right? So I think that suggests that a pretty reasonable average income tax rate is about 40%, but that the top tax rates should be about 80% or something like that, because the rich are much less elastic and the top income share has been going up a lot. So that's extremely progressive, right? So that would require a total change to our tax system. 40% on most people is a fair bit higher, but 80% on the rich is hugely different than our system. It's much more similar to what France has put in recently, right? So one natural question, is that because our tax system is wrong and we should have higher taxes? Or is that because the analysis that we just did was wrong in some way? One way to argue that the analysis we did was wrong is to say that the long-term elasticity is just way, 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 way higher. Over the long term, if you had higher taxes, people would be working a lot less in ways that you can't pick up possibly in these short-term studies. So one argument that people have made is that that a lot of what you're doing when you work hard early in your career is not earning money, but earning the chance to rise up in your career and make more money later. And if you knew that you were going to be taxed on that money that you would earn later, then you wouldn't work as hard now. So that's one argument people have made about why this might be much larger. Another argument people have made is people might change careers. I don't know if you guys looked at the problem set relevant to this. Not so obvious that people changing careers would be such a terrible thing if people who are currently working in finance decided to go work in academia. In some form, that's just them being lazy because they're earning less income that way. But I'm not sure we would all think that that's a bad thing. OK. So I think that this is a very elegant analysis, a very powerful, simple analysis. But I think it leaves out many of the most important issues of optimal income taxes. So one issue that it leaves out is that the rich may be rich not because they're more talented or just had a higher wage, but because they wanted money more than other people did, right? So like, imagine there are two types of people who like to watch sunsets and people who like to go to fancy restaurants. Then it wouldn't really make sense to take money from the people who like to go to fancy restaurants to give it to the people who like to watch sunsets, because they don't have anything to do with the money, right? So to the extent that that's the case, you wouldn't want to redistribute so much. Another possibility is that not everyone might be the same behind the veil of ignorance, right? You might think that I sort of own my genetics, and that people who are born more able really should succeed more, right? So that you might not want to insure. There might not be anyone who could enter into an insurance contract with that because there's no you before you have your genetic code. There might be some limit to this veil of ignorance reasoning, right? Another issue, which Andy, I think, was bringing up, was like, who is behind the veil of ignorance? All the people currently alive, all the people who might potentially be born, people from which countries, et cetera, right? Do we care as much about people who live in Africa as we do about people in the United States? That doesn't seem to be consistent with our tax policies, right? We'd be sending a huge amount of money to people in Africa if we tried to implement this on a global scale, right? Some people would argue that the wealthy might actually be smarter at allocating things to charity or to new businesses, and therefore it might not make sense to redistribute so much money away from them. Another thing is that inequality, and this goes in the opposite direction, inequality might actually undermine social order or cause crime or unrest in various ways. And you can look at some of the problem sets for the 242 students as examples of that. And to the extent that that's the case, that might give an additional reason why you want to reduce inequality. Another thing is that some people might not reduce how much they're working very much, but they might choose whether to work at all or not. And one reason why we give the earned income tax credit, give people a subsidy for getting into the labor force at all, is that that might affect whether they are working at all or not. Another issue is that, if we think that some professions are not as socially valuable as others, then taxes can affect which professions people go into. Now this is just a small sample of a huge number of issues that come up in optimal redistribution. The truth is the analysis has been focused mostly on the types of issues I've been talking about and has neglected many of these. And so I think it's a really important open area. So anyways, thanks. Have a great Thanksgiving, everybody.
I got my